Hey, I was going to wait till we got to 20, but I think 19 will do just fine. So welcome everybody to the NEPA Ninja webinar. I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Caroline Weiler. I am a program specialist with the Division of Outdoor Recreation. So, you've probably seen a lot of our emails come through if you got notified about this particular webinar, but we offer a variety of grants and programs within our division. And so I myself manage the Recreational Trails Program, which is a federal grant to aid recreational trails. And then just to give you guys a little bit of just about everything else we do, we've got a number of grants that are open currently. The UORG grant opened up just last week, I believe, and closes in March. We have our Outdoor Recreation Planning Assistance Program that closes in January. Our OHV grant opened yesterday. We've got a lot going on. Please look at our website to stay up to breast about what's going on in our division. But for our purposes today, we're here to talk about everybody's favorite thing, NEPA, the four-letter word that gets us so excited. And we're really excited and super grateful to have two of our guest speakers today. Carissa and Jenna are both going to give us a little bit of background on what NEPA is and the gists of what they do and how they can be of assistance to you as you begin to plan and develop new projects. So to give you a little bit of a background, Carissa is an environmental program manager at UDOT, and I bombard her almost daily with questions regarding NEPA and our applicants. She assists us with managing the RTP environmental process on the UDOT side. So making sure that if you have a recreational trails program that requires NEPA, that she kind of gets, she helps you get your ducks in a row on that. So she is the point person for anything with UDOT clearances. So we're super lucky to have her. Thank you, Carissa, for being here with us. And then our second guest is Jenna. She is actually the quote unquote NEPA Ninja. I think it's actually on her business cards. That's where we coined this meeting term from her. And she's an environmental coordinator with Jones and DeMille Engineering. So that means basically that she says, quote unquote, that she tries to keep her engineers out of trouble and in compliance with environmental regulations. She spent the first 10 years of her career with the Forest Service, did stints with the BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and works in biology and environmental compliance with them. She's also got perspectives from both sides of the processes of being an applicant and then also performing those clearances herself. She loves environmental policy and outdoor recreation, so we're really excited to have her and Carissa join us today. I know that you guys probably have a lot of questions that you're going to want specific answers for. I've talked to Carissa and Jenna. They're both more than willing to answer your questions, but I think we're going to leave that to the end of the presentation. So they'll give their presentation and then we'll allow time for you guys to unmute and ask the questions in person, or if you want to throw them in the chat, we can kind of look through those at the end as well. So with that, I'm going to give the time over to Jenna and Carissa for the presentation. And we're really, again, thankful for you guys for being here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Jenna, were you going to present?
Yes. I'm just trying to figure out how to do that now with the presenter view that it's not letting me share.
Yeah, I think I have you as a co-host, so you should have the permissions, but if it's not working, I can pull up the slideshow as well.
Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
We can.
Okay.
Okay, so I think we can, we're all introduced. Okay, so what is NEPA? NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act that requires federal agencies to assess the environmental effects of their proposed action, so in this case, a trail, prior to making decisions. And the NEPA process can also be used to provide opportunities to inform the public and have comment periods and review. And so since this is, as Caroline mentioned, a federal program, a federal grant program with federal funding, it then therefore invokes NEPA. Sometimes we see a number of trails that either traverse U.S. Forest Service or BLM lands, and oftentimes those federal agencies will complete their own NEPA document And so if you're just a project sponsor, they usually have that NEPA completed. So a lot of questions that we get, do we need NEPA if it, crosses private property? Yes, we do, because it's the federal funding is what's in play here on these RTP projects. Sometimes we get, what about trail maintenance? So if a project has already been cleared, let's say it's a 6-foot wide trail and you want to do some maintenance on that because, it's a mountain bike trail and there's rutting. If you're staying within that existing footprint of what's already been cleared, then you're okay and NEPA won't be required. Sometimes we get questions of like, oh, well, NEPA was covered on this other project. Let's say a recreation center was built, but we want to add a trail along the outside of the property. So we would look at, okay, was where this trail's going, is it within that existing footprint, and how old was, the documentation? Sometimes we're able to reuse information that's been done, like a cultural resources survey, but there are timing restrictions. Like it's only good for basically, usually we say about 5 years, because, if you have a cultural survey that was done 30 years ago, well, it's not counting, those additional 30 years that have since passed, and things may now be considered historic. So I think we can move on to the next slide. So yeah, the Recreational Trails Program, it's a program under the Federal Highway Administration, and it's administered by the Utah Division of Outdoor Recreation. And so, like I had mentioned, this program uses federal funds, and with those federal dollars, NEPA needs to be completed. And FHWA has assigned its NEPA responsibilities to UDOT, which is why I'm here. So next slide, kind of covered the different NEPA classes of action. The first, they kind of go in order of scope and complexity. So the first is called a categorical exclusion. And it's a class of action that does not individually or cumulatively have a significant effect on the human environment. So each federal agency will make a list of, these types of categories, and with one of them being bike and pedaling paths and facilities, which is what most of these RTP projects fall under. If a project is not applicable to be a categorical exclusion, it may be an environmental assessment, and that's prepared to determine whether or not the project has the potential to cause any significant impacts, environmental effects. And then an environmental impact statement, I haven't seen, one of those come through the RTP process, but those are definitely when there's significant potential to significantly affect the natural environment. So most of what we're dealing with is our categorical exclusions, and the RTP environmental study form that's on the Utah RTP website, that is our version of a categorical exclusion for these projects. You can get the next slide. So NEPA also requires compliance with other federal regulations, so like the Clean Water Act or the Endangered Species Act. And today we're going to go into like a bit more detail about the 3 big ones. So cultural resources, waters, and wildlife. And these are also the 3 resources that require UDOT concurrence from UDOT's resource specialists. And as Caroline had mentioned, we'll in these upcoming slides, we'll be talking more about, obtaining those concurrence requests, but they should all go through me, and then I will coordinate with them. Sometimes we get, our landscape architect like, hey, I just got an email about this project, and, their first time hearing about it. But when it comes through me, we're able to track things, get the correct project description. And UDOT also has a number of its own trail projects that are going on, so it kind of helps to differentiate everything. So I think now I'm going to pass it over to Jenna. She's going to cover some of these resources and strategies to help you demonstrate compliance efficiently.
Thanks, Carissa. All right, so the first big one is cultural. If your project doesn't already have the NEPA done, if you're not in that nice cleared 6-foot trail like Carissa described, and if it's been more than 5 years since a cultural survey has been done, you should plan on doing a survey. This has to be done by a qualified archaeologist. They have to be permitted with the state, and they follow a very specific process. What we're looking for is sites that we can avoid. A lot of times with a single track mountain bike trail, you can avoid sites if you find them. If you really can't avoid something, you're going to be talking about mitigation. There's time involved, there's costs involved. So knowing what's out there can be really important in routing a good trail. So just have that in your mind. We need to be aware of what the cultural resources are. Here's an example. This is a bike trail system that we're working on. This is actually an active project with Garfield County. We are working with the BLM on this one, and it's not an RTP project, but to give you an illustration, the county had a general idea of where they wanted the trail to go. We coordinated with the BLM archaeologist, and he said, I would like you to do at least 100-foot buffer, because what you're probably going to find is that there are cultural sites by this trail that you want to do. And if we survey wide enough, you'll be able to route around them. So there are a number of sites out at this spot. You can see these red polygons. These are cultural sites. And we wanted to make it easy. We said, we'll commit, we will avoid cultural sites. Well, some of the trail goes right through some cultural sites. But since we surveyed wide enough, we're going to be able to wiggle the trails outside of the cultural sites while still staying within the cultural survey area. So it's a good thing to plan to have some contingency and some flexibility so that when you inevitably find something, some project, you've already got the survey done to allow you to move into a cleared site. So the archaeologist will do the on-the-ground survey, and they will prepare a report. And they're going to send that report to UDOT.
So the report will be sent to me, and I will distribute it to our cultural resources manager. And so if your project is disturbing new ground, oftentimes tribal consultation will be required. And so just to be aware, that is a 30-day consultation period window. So just adding that time on. And then if, you're unable to avoid those sites and you are going to have an adverse effect, as Jenna was talking about, you will have, she mentioned it will be more time and it will be more money. And UDOT will consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, also known as the SHPO, to work out what that mitigation looks like. So as Jenna mentioned, if you can avoid any, avoid impacting cultural sites, and oftentimes when, since trails are so narrow and kind of have more flexibility, it can be easy enough to reroute them.
Okay, the next big resource we want to talk about is wildlife and plants. There are federal regulations that protect these resources specifically. So the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. You have to comply with these regulations regardless. So I usually advise people to assume presence. If you're going to have to cut down trees to build your trail, assume that a bird could nest there. If you've got to disturb new ground, assume that there could be plants there. Similar to the cultural, until you know they're not there, plan for them to be there and plan to mitigate. So let's get started thinking what kind of species you might need to consider. The Fish and Wildlife Service does have an online website. This is their information for planning and consultation tool. It's very easy to use. So you get started. You acknowledge that you know what you're doing. What you can do is navigate to your project site. And you can either, if you've got a trail alignment figured out, maybe we want to draw or want to build a trail next to a river. You simply draw it in. You finish your drawing. We'll assume 100 feet width. The Fish and Wildlife Service is going to take whatever shape you put in, compare it against their species data, and then they will give you a species list of species that need to be considered. This doesn't mean that the species occur there. It means that they could occur there. So particularly if you're working next to the water, you may need to consider yellow-billed cuckoo. It's a riparian species. And Euclides tresses is a big one. So this is just to help you identify whether there could be endangered or threatened species in the area and whether you might need to have a qualified biologist do surveys. If you're working on public lands, BLM and Forest Service also have sensitive species. So just another level to be aware of. They are not the same as the listed species, but you may have to address them. And there are also state sensitive species. So the state has its website. Oh, that's going to pull up. Where they've also documented, oh, well, I didn't have that pulled up. I apologize. You can also check and see, though, if there are occurrences or records, at least, of other species that you might need to be concerned about. So in the event that you do have vegetation that's going to need to be removed or potential for species, there are some things that you can plan on doing to save yourself time and effort. So if you have to remove vegetation, we've got to comply with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which means you can't take nests. If a bird has built a nest, you can't remove that nest. One easy way around this is to wait until fall. The birds are done nesting. You can go in and cut down the trees without worrying about violating that law. A lot of times that's not going to work for your construction schedules. So you can plan to do pre-construction surveys where you could have a qualified biologist go survey the trail alignment, typically at 7 to 10 days before the work happens. If they find a nest, you're still going to have to avoid it, but they may be able to clear that trail, and then you know that you're okay to go in and remove that vegetation. So just being aware that you have the ability to plan your schedule might save you some trouble on the other side. Another example is with plants. So this is the Euclides tress. They are a threatened species. If you are within 300 feet of these plants, Fish and Wildlife Service may have some concerns because construction can cause dust and vibrations that could impact the plants. So one solution that they've proposed on other projects is to just avoid doing construction during flowering season. These plants flower typically July, August, maybe into September. So again, if you can plan to do your construction after September, this may not be a concern. You can save yourself a whole lot of trouble with Fish and Wildlife Service if you can plan to reduce your impacts before you even get to them. So once you have your surveys done, those get sent to UDOT, and UDOT takes the next step. On to Carissa.
Yeah, so I'll forward them along to our natural resources manager and he'll review the findings. So if there's, determined to be no effect to threatened and endangered species, he'll write a concurrence memo stating as such. However, if the project may affect threatened and endangered species, that will add time. Our natural resources manager will coordinate with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so if it's not likely to adversely affect, that adds 2 months. If you are likely to adversely affect a species, that can take 4.5 months. So it's best to, like Jenna mentioned, if you can, avoid construction during these sensitive times, during nesting periods, and that will save your project more time in the long run, being able to not have to go through this process.
Okay, the last big resource is water. The Clean Water Act is kind of the overarching regulation that we run into here. And again, you've got to comply with the Clean Water Act regardless of funding. So again, have a plan. If you can avoid or mitigate, that's going to save you time and budget. The Fish and Wildlife Service does have a waters online web map. So this is the National Wetlands Inventory, or NWI. My general rule is if there's anything wet, you're going to have to deal with water. The caveat is that there are some channels that aren't wet all the time. And those may still be jurisdictional waters that are covered under the Clean Water Act. So the nice thing about the National Wetlands Inventory is that it typically identifies those channels as well. They're called either ephemeral or intermittent. So you can, again, zoom into your project area and see if you need to do more work. So this is actually out just east of Glenwood in Sevier County. We've hosted the some NICA races here for the last couple of years. So we got approval from the BLM to build this bike trail for the course. You can see that there are some blue lines that would indicate that there's waters out there. It is bone dry. Like it's never wet out there. But these are in fact channels that would have to be permitted if we were going to do any fill within them. For most bike trails, if you're just doing mountain bike trails, you may not have to worry about that. If the trail can just go through the water. If you're talking about having to build something to get over the water though, that's when you may run into permitting with the Army Corps. If you have to put fill material into a water, you've stepped it up a level. So that's where you can start though, is with that NWI Mapper to identify if you're going to need to worry about any of that permitting. So if you do have wet spots, you would need to get a qualified aquatic resources specialist to do a wetland delineation. And then they would really identify if there are any wetlands or waters that would be jurisdictional that might require additional action. So once you have that information, again, that goes back to UDOT.
So if you do the NWI Mapper and there's no waters, and let's say your proposed trail, our landscape architect will still provide a concurrence on that stating as such. So again, it'll be sent to me and I will forward it to our landscape architect for review in the concurrence memo, which would outline any permits that would be required to be obtained prior to construction.
Okay, so those were the big three, but there are a few other policies and some other regulation that you should be aware of. The Farmland Protection Policy Act is concerned with prime farmlands. The NRCS oversees this. So if you, for example, wanted to build a trail and you were going to have to build it in a field, if you got property rights to do that, if those soils are classified as prime farmlands, you may have to go through a process with the NRCS to authorize that. And they may have you look at alternatives to minimize those impacts. So if you have that in your mind in the first place, you may be able to save yourself some time and say, maybe we should look somewhere else. Floodplains, probably never a good idea to build trails in a floodplain as it is, but if that's where it's got to go, be aware that you may have to do some additional engineering and get some permits to even make that possible. Air quality can be a concern if you're in some of our more urban areas. So like Utah County, Salt Lake County, they already have some air quality stipulations. So that'll probably come into play during construction. You may just have to be aware that there may be some additional requirements, dust control plans, or, well, that might be it for equipment operation. And then stormwater control. If you are constructing a project that is going to disturb more than 1 acre of ground, you have to have coverage under the Utah construction general permit. It's a pretty easy process. You prepare a stormwater pollution prevention plan for construction, you file for coverage. You just have to make sure you do it. So being aware of some of these additional requirements can help you streamline your plans and make sure you're thinking of heading off problems before they arise. Another point I wanted to make is that we want you to treat this as a partnership. UDOT is here to help. In order to get this funding, you want your project to be legally defensible. And that's what all of this is about. You are documenting that you are going to be in compliance with the Endangered Species Act. You're going to be in compliance with the cultural regulations. You're going to be in compliance with the Clean Water Act and the Farmland Policy Protection Act. And NEPA, which is a process policy as well. So it's not that people are looking for reasons to stop the project. It's that you need to have that documentation that shows that you've followed the process, so that if someone did object to your project, a judge could look at that and say, I understand that you object, but they've done things the right way and the project can move forward. One more thought. So this is another trail project. This is on the west side of Richfield, and this was with the Forest Service. We wanted to consider 38 miles of trails. We didn't know where everything was going to go. That's a lot of trail to figure out and map. So we did a corridor approach where we said, we're going to analyze maybe 300 feet so that we had the NEPA covered and we would narrow it down later. But at least that way we had the flexibility to move our trail and still stay within the area that had been authorized. If you have other components to the project, so we had trailheads, we needed to make sure that the trailheads were covered. If you have staging areas for equipment, those need to be included in your project description. So what else is there beyond the trail itself that is going to be covered with this federal funding? Because that needs to be included as well. We call these connected actions. What else has to happen to make this project feasible? Yeah, so I guess that's my takeaway there. That is the presentation. So we're going to turn it back over to Caroline to lead questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jenna and Carissa. I think that's just valuable information to have a general overview of what goes on. People talk about CADXs and what is an EA. And so I love that you went into the details of what that all looks like. So thank you. We had a couple questions come in through the chat while we were talking. For Carissa, what region in UDOT are you working in, or what regions?
I work out of our central office, and all of the RTP projects are covered in our central office. So they wouldn't go to our Region 4 archaeologists, they would stay within our central division, just to kind of, for easier coordination for us.
Awesome. She does it all. And then from John from Provo, is there a NEPA anticipated timeline and steps graphic or document? So kind of just an overarching, is there a document somewhere or guidance for all this information in easy to read way?
Not in, I would say, an easy to read way. And with the projects, since they can vary so much in scope, and it greatly can affect their timeline. So as you know, we mentioned, if you are adversely affecting like an endangered species, that adds 4.5 months, when if you have no impacts to cultural, waters, or wildlife, your environmental document can be completed in 1.5 months.
Right, the whole it depends answer, Okay.
Maybe I could make a point here. It can really help if you hire a good consultant who's familiar with all of these different pieces and can think through the timelines and help you formulate a plan and a schedule and a budget. There are a number of environmental consulting firms in the state, and a number of engineering firms that have environmental experts. This is something that they do all the time. I mean, that's what I do. I do NEPA all the time. And so that's what I'm thinking all along is, okay, how can we fit all the pieces together to do this most efficiently? Try to raise concerns early on so that we might be able to avoid some of those concerns and save on the schedule and budget. I think it's a good investment, I guess is what I'm saying. It'll pay off in the long run to have someone who's familiar with all this help you go through the NEPA process.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, that we're not expecting applicants to be able to know, where and when and how all these resources are necessary for their, for their NEPA documents. I think those websites that you provided were awesome for them to get a general gist. But yeah, hiring out a contractor to do your NEPA, I think, is a vital part of all of this. And just as a plug for the RTP specifically, I know if you've been to our grant workshops, I've said this before, but you can actually use RTP funding to pay for your NEPA. And that can be backdated up to 18 months prior to the contract. So if you've heard about our grants, we always say don't spend until the contract is in place. This is the one option where you can actually backdate 18 months prior and say, hey, we did our environmental cultural clearances last spring. We got awarded this fall, and that works. You can still use it. So just a plug for that. Okay, looks like those were all the chat questions. Are there any other questions specific that you'd like to ask Carissa and Jenna?
They asked if we had templates or examples. I put in the template for, what our categorical exclusion form looks like for these RTP projects. But I don't, Caroline, would we be able to share kind of an example of a CADX that had been completed that we like?
Yeah, I know you had shared one with me a while ago. I can see if I can find that still.
And what qualifies a biologist to do a survey? So if you don't have to do if just to look up on, I guess, the IPAC report, that can be anybody. You don't need to be qualified to do that. But if you're talking about migratory birds or desert tortoise or yellow-billed cuckoo, it depends upon the species. Different species have different requirements. And Jenna, you might be able to go into more detail about that.
There are some species where you have to have specific certification. Utah prairie dog is when you can't do the surveys unless you've been to the Fish and Wildlife Service training. For some of the plants, I think you have to have written confirmation from Fish and Wildlife Service that you're qualified. There is more flexibility with migratory birds. I think desert tortoise, but there are specific protocols too that have to be followed. So again, most professional service groups will have qualified people on staff who can do either those surveys or know someone who does. But you can always check with UDOT or Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that if you have someone that you're not sure about, you can check their qualifications and confirm before you have any work done.
Okay, I'm still searching for that one that you sent, Carissa, but I think this would be a good, this is a good question for us to maybe put some better resources on our website. So if I can kind of compile a couple different options so that you guys have templates of, okay, what does it look like? What does that document actually, consist of? So I'm going to work on that and maybe update our website with more information, because I think that's a great point of just getting a template of exactly what that looks like. And again, hiring out obviously is a great way to do that so that they can compile it all for you, but having an idea of what it will look like is something we can provide. Are there any other questions currently for Carissa or Jenna? Oh, thanks, Betsy. So IMBA has an intro to NEPA document that might be useful as a basic overview. Perfect. Betsy deals with NEPA probably more than most as well with her role with the National Park Service. So thank you for that. That's a great, great tool.
I'm curious, do any of the folks here have trails that might cross public lands with BLM or Forest Service, or is that all pretty much on private?
I have one that crosses land for the USA and the state forestry, fire and state lands.
Okay. So when you involve another federal agency, we like to consolidate NEPA. You can do one NEPA process that'll cover all the federal requirements. So it would be really important to coordinate with a federal agency as you're getting into this. And I don't know, Carissa, if you've had that come up on these RTP projects before, but I would assume that UDOT would still be the lead agency, but you may have a few additional requirements for the forest or BLM just to check some of their specific policy boxes. But yeah, the idea is that they can all use the same NEPA process. So make sure that you're involving them early.
Yeah, so when usually after they decide which projects are awarded, we'll sit down. I'll sit down with Caroline and we'll go through the list of the projects, and many a times the Park Service or BLM has already completed that NEPA documentation, so we aren't going to make you do it over again.
Can I connect with you after to go over that? Because we've had some interesting navigations for that project.
Yeah.
Do I need to, I had our contact information up on the screen, put that back up.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, or I can put it in the chat too. Perfect. Okay. Oh yeah, this was a question from Kathy. Planning a nature trail in Wasatch Mountain State Park near Soldier Hollow. I think she had asked me originally too, kind of concerning the timeline. I know that you guys had mentioned, if you've done environmental, clearances, cultural clearances in years prior, does that still count for something on a new project in the same area? Maybe could you go over the timeline again of how long you can use previous NEPA clearances for?
And usually it's for like the cultural surveys, it's 5 years. For threatened and endangered species reports, they're about 3 years. So if you're unsure, feel free to reach out and we can take a look and see if what your proposed action is falls under the previous NEPA documentation. And so with your project at Wasatch Mountain State Park, since the state park, another federal agency wouldn't be completing that NEPA, so it would just go through our process.
Perfect. Thank you. Does that answer your question, Kathy? And then from Todd, just asking to explain the differences between CADX and non-CADX processes.
Yeah, so CADX processes are like the most simple process. If you can see the form, it's kind of like a checklist and just briefly describing your impacts. When you move on to an environmental assessment, there are required periods, to obtain public feedback. And when you have an environmental impact statement, you're required to have public meetings as well as numerous opportunities for the public to provide their input. And they're much more rigorous documents. A CADX can be about 8 pages, and EA is 75 pages, and EIS is 150 pages. You have to look at the different resources. There's more resources you have to look at, impacts to like energy and the cumulative effects and indirect effects. And so the CADXs are by far the easiest and quickest ones to do. But if, you may be required, I would say, like, when would a trail project turn into an EA? I would say if let's say you're potentially going to have a really significant effect on a resource, you would have to then kind of upgrade that class of action. Public meetings, like a public hearing, may be required if somehow your trail changes access to, let's say, somebody's driveway. If you have to reroute somebody's driveway or something because of where your trail is going for some reason, that would then initiate a public hearing. So you're more than welcome to contact us to make sure that, you think your trail would qualify as a categorical exclusion.
Yeah, I was going to say, I wish there was kind of one answer fits all for all of these, but I've learned, in my short time managing this federal fund, that every situation is very different depending on, where you are and the issues in the area. So I guess like it goes into Kathy's question too. Are you okay if people are sending you their maps and their areas? How best can they utilize you, Carissa? I know you're a busy person, so what's the best way to get your help with these?
We love KMZs. KMZs are the easiest for us to use. So that's just on Google Earth. You can kind of like plot your trail. That is the easiest for like our resource specialists to go through and see if there's resources. But I would, we're busy. And so if you can go and, for let's say waters, if you can go and do that NWI map search and see that you don't have any impacts to waters, then you can send it over to me and I can have our landscape architect verify that, yeah, you're not going to require a wetland delineation report. You don't have to hire a consultant for that. But you almost always will have to hire a cultural resources consultant to prepare your report. Like the one we recently did was like a kiosk down in Bryan Head. It was a big kiosk. and they were putting it in a parking lot, and our cultural resources manager was able to just kind of prepare the report because it was already in disturbed ground and the impacts were so minor. But most of the time, these trails are disturbing new ground, and so then you need to have an archaeologist go and look at the project area.
Perfect. Yeah, I guess I would say too, just with all of these things, keeping in good communication with our division as well as Carissa. I reach out to Carissa all the time with project questions. So just continuing to keep us in the loop of what's going on with your project. We would hate to have, a situation where you were awarded funds and because of certain, negligence on complying with NEPA that you can't actually use those funds. So please stay in contact with us as you do. If you are using RTP funding, I think we've catered this a lot towards that. I know not everyone's going to be using this with RTP funding, but if you are, please stay in contact with us. Great, those are awesome questions. We do have a couple more minutes left. Does anyone else have any last minute questions or comments before we close out? Okay. Awesome. Well, if you do and things come up kind of later on, please again, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is there. More than happy to talk NEPA with you guys. Just once again, big thank you to Jenna and Carissa for all you do. I'm going to put a plug in for Jenna as well. She's going to actually be presenting at our Trails Forum later on in May. So she will give kind of a more detailed presentation about NEPA as it comes to trails. I know a lot of us are building trails and managing trails. So plug for her. That's going to be May 10th and 11th down in Richfield. So it'll be exciting. We'll go and look at actually those trails that she's worked on up there on the Pavant. So anyway, thank you again, everybody, for attending. And just look out for, we're going to kind of continue to do more webinars like this for various aspects that we get questions about a lot from our division. So just keep a lookout for those. And thank you so much.
Thanks.
And yes, there are tickets available through our website. If you go to, it's just the recreation.utah.gov, you can find our Trails Forum link there and get tickets for that. Thank you.